Hello, this lesson covers appropriation accounts and using appropriation accounts in the UN software. Please turn to page 20 in your new client handbook. And as you can see, we start off with the menu path, Accounting, Maintenance, Appropriation Accounts. So to get to this section, we'll go to Accounting, Maintenance, Appropriation Accounts. Alphabetically, it's the first one on your list, your maintenance list. Excuse me. A little tongue-tied. And just like with revenue account codes, we have a sample list of appropriation account codes in our appropriation accounts area. Now turning back to our overview on page 20. An appropriation account is a detailed line item within a fund used to appropriate monies for encumbrance and expenditure. So in other words, purchase orders or payments, or both. Appropriation accounts are defined by fund, a program, an object, and optionally a cost center, just like cost centers with revenue accounts. Available programs and objects vary by entity type and fund type as defined by the UN Chart of Accounts. Well, there's that Chart of Accounts again. So if we look at our Chart of Accounts for our township sample, we can see we already looked at funds, revenue account codes, and here we have appropriation account codes, or appropriation program codes, and then object codes. Well, the program portion, this is essentially where you're going to spend the money. Are you going to spend it in general government or public safety, public works? Are you going to spend it on highways, on cemeteries, etc.? So that's how you designate, okay, we got this fund, we're going to spend it in these particular areas. And then what are you going to spend it on in those particular areas? Are they going to be, is it going to be for salaries? That's your object codes. Fringe benefits, purchase services, etc. So that's the breakdown of appropriation accounts. And I've got a little PowerPoint slide. So you basically have to pick your fund, your program, and then your object code. So the fund, then where you're spending it, and then I have a number there. I'm not sure that should be just our little sample. 3-digit number, and then a cost center, with it, which is optional. And again, that's driven by this Chart of Accounts. You need to follow. You can't change these descriptions here, and you want to really study your Chart of Accounts and make sure that you have a good handle on this so you can pick appropriate, when you're converting, that you can convert to appropriate appropriation codes. As we'll see in the conversion section, you'll fill out a worksheet outlining all of this information for your revenues and your appropriation accounts and budgets when you get to that. Now for our township, we're assuming we do have a sample set here already, and we're just going to add a few appropriation accounts, again for our Hayes Bequest Fund. Just like with the revenues, we can add several at the same time. So I'm actually going to skip to exercise number 2 in the book on page 21, and we'll do that first. We'll add a few revenue account codes, or appropriation account codes. So anything new needs to be, we need to use the Add button. And this looks very similar to our revenue form. We first have to pick the fund. In our case, it's the Hayes Bequest 4952 fund. Notice, by the way, I don't know if I pointed this out, when I start typing, it'll narrow down my list of items based on what I type. So if I type in number 4, it narrows it down to anything beginning with a 4, 9. It'll narrow it down even further, and that's enough to pick Hayes Bequest. And then I have to select a program code. So we got 3 levels for appropriation accounts. So we need to select a program code here. In our case, it's going to be 410 for cemeteries. And then finally, we have a list of object codes. And I'll explain why we have the indentations a little bit here later. And this other column, direct charges. But for right now, we're just going to pick the account codes we want to add to our new Hayes Bequest Fund. So I can scroll down. One little trick I want to point out, and for those of you who like to use the middle scroll button on your mouse, if you got one of those scroll wheels on your mouse, actually you will, provided, I believe, with the UN computer. Be a little careful here, because it's going to, this is just a Microsoft thing. Our programmers could not program around this. Depending on where your focus is of your mouse, if you click here under Funds or Program, when you use that scroll wheel, it starts moving whatever, where you're focused. Notice under Program, see how it's moving from 410 back to 300 to 200, all the way through that. Well, I don't want it to do that. I actually want to scroll down this list without changing my program. So I'm going to go back to 410. Make sure if you're going to use that middle scroll wheel to click on the one of these fields here. You don't have to select anything like the checkbox. Just click on it so you can see that little outline around the object code. And now when I use the scroll wheel, see how it's moving through the list? You have to be a little careful with that. It's a nice feature, so you don't have to keep clicking this button here. But be aware of how that works. So we're going to choose just a couple of accounts. Let's see, 320 property services, and then 350 utilities. So again, we can add these at the same time. Notice that they'll appear at the bottom of our list. So we have a short list. And so when I click on Save, it added those 2 items. And to close, I'll close it. It closes the form. So it's as simple as that. So you can add multiple ones for each program within a fund. You can add multiple accounts at the same time. So that's our first highlight in the book. Add several in a single step. All right, well, I've been promising to go over the Activate and Deactivate buttons, and so now the time has finally arrived. And we're going to talk about all 3 of these buttons here, the Remove, Activate, and Deactivate buttons. So many of the screens we've looked at cost centers, funds, revenue account codes. There are several other screens that have Activate and Deactivate buttons, and some of them, most of those also have Remove buttons. So let's look at our book. The Remove button is pretty self-explanatory. It will remove whatever item that you select on your list if it's removable. So in this case with appropriation accounts that have not been used in the current accounting year can be removed. If any activity occurred within an account during the current year, the account may not be removed until the subsequent year. So right now it's 2011, if I had any activity associated with, for instance, with these account codes that I just added here, the 4952 account codes, then I would not be able to remove them. Right now, it would allow me to remove these account codes if I clicked on that checkbox. Notice also it showed under the status filter here, this drop-down menu. If I click on that, this only by default shows me the active account codes. I haven't got to active and deactive. But if we look at the drop-down menu, I can see the removable accounts. I think we saw this with revenues. Well, there's a whole lot of them that are removable, so I could delete any of these. But those a few of them below are that are active are not removable. And Well, I'll explain that in a moment. Well, it looks like this, the one of them is the capital outlay. You look, keep your eye on that. When I select removable, it disappears. Okay, it's one that will not allow me to delete. So if I go back here, try to delete it, I get an error message. Well, I have an appropriation budget. I have a setup for that. I have a purchase order set up for that. Remember, that's our capital project fund, the 4301 from a prior year, and we have a carryover purchase order from our Buckeye Township story. So we can't remove it. It has some activity that isn't complete as of this year. Well, so let's get back to our book. Definitions of the activate and deactivate buttons. These buttons control whether items will be displayed or not displayed on drop-down menus and certain reports. Deactivating an item will not affect transactions prior to its deactivating. For example, we will be deactivating an account used for the township's capital project fund. That's that account code I just showed you. I tried to remove, but it wouldn't let me get rid of. The account has an open purchase order that was carried over from last year. The account will no longer be available to create new purchase orders, but it is still available for payments, available in the payments form for payments related to the carryover PO. So that's a mouthful. But what is that saying? Well, I'll show you, and to show you, I'll need to jump ahead a little bit here. To deactivate this account code, right now this account code is active. Notice the status here. If I click on display, it tells me whether it's active or inactive. So this account code is currently active. And that means, don't pay attention to the details here, just we're jumping ahead. If I try to open a purchase order for this using this account code, again, you can ignore all this. On a purchase order, I have to select my account codes. If I scroll down this list, I can find the capital outlay 4301 760 700 account code, and I could potentially use it for this purchase order. Okay, I'm going to erase that. I'm going to leave that there and minimize my purchase order screen. I'm going to come back here to Appropriation Accounts, and we look at capital outlay. What's active? Well, let's see what happens when I deactivate that account code. I select the checkbox next to the account code, click on Deactivate, this button. It gets removed from my list. Well, why is it gone? Because by default, only the active account codes are listed here. Well, it's still in the software, it's just hidden. If I select this filter, I can look at my inactive account codes. Inactive, I've deactivated it, so now it's inactive. Or I can select all, and it'll show me my account codes, whether they're active or inactive. All right, so we're going to look at, this is still inactive now. If I go back to my purchase order and look for that account code to use on a new purchase order for this year, well, it's not there. 4301 doesn't even show up on the list. And that's the advantage of it. I still want to use this account for an existing purchase order I have open that carried over from the previous year, but I don't want to accidentally pick this account code when I'm creating some other purchase order or some other payment unrelated to that carryover. So I've deactivated it, and by deactivating it, it prevents me from using that account code or for it to even show up on certain forms. Another application of this, let me look at our book, I might actually have it in here. Well, right here, deactivating may be useful for purchase orders and payments. Deactivating will ensure that you don't unintentionally pick an account code for a PO or a payment. Deactivated accounts won't even show up as an option in the drop-down menus. Now, it won't show up, but however, it says the account is no longer to create for new purchase orders, but it will still be available in the payments form for payments that are related, in our example, to the carryover purchase order or anything prior. So maybe it wasn't a carry. Let's say I make a payment to ABC Company. I make it twice a year, okay, and in February and September. Well, let's say I go. It's February. I make my I open a purchase order, and I make my payment. 50% of it in February, and I still have, the purchase order open, payments made. I don't want to accidentally pick that account code in between February and September, so I can deactivate the account code or codes associated with that that payment. If I do that, then any other purchase order or payment I make throughout the year, I won't be able to even see that account code when I go to my various screens and forms. But come September, I can still use that purchase order I had open before I deactivated the account code. Also, this is not a hard and fast rule. I can activate and deactivate this as much as I want throughout the year. It makes no difference. So if you want, I can leave it on all here so it won't disappear. I've deactivated it, and now I've activated it again. So it's just a matter of whether you want it to be hidden or show up on certain reports or certain forms. On the reports, it's hidden. On the forms, it won't be available except for transactions that were created before the account was deactivated. So, show you another example related to reports. If I go to Appropriation Reports and look at my, well, a better example would be my Appropriation Chart of Accounts, I can see that, let's see, this is inactive. And so by default, this account code doesn't show up on my report. There's no 4300s here. But if I go to the filter, notice that it's filtered by active. And so here it's still in the software, and I can still print a report by it for it, but it doesn't automatically show up on this report. Well, again, that's jumping ahead a lot, so I will go ahead and stop there. We'll revisit this later on in class. All right. Last thing I want to show you before we move on to budgets. And I guess I want to say one other thing about activating and deactivating. By deactivating this account code, that does not mean that the fund is deactivated. These are completely separate. So I can deactivate an appropriation account code in this fund, 4301, but if I go to funds, my sewer replacement fund, that's still active. Still see that's active there. Same thing for the revenue accounts associated with this replacement fund, etc. It only deactivates or activates the particular line item and will only affect those. So I could print a report showing even though I've deactivated that account, I could print a fund status report showing the status of this sewer replacement fund. All right, lastly, I'm going to start to add some accounts and show you an error message that I get. Let me just pick an example here. I think this will do it. All right, so here it appears that I should be able to add these account codes, but I'm getting a system error message, and it says, adding accounts with the selected object codes will result in a mixture of active, summary, and detail objects for at least one financial reporting group. Well, what's it talking about there? It's like financial reporting groups. Well, if we go to our chart of accounts, it's not going to let me open that right away, so let me read the rest of it. Utilizing a mixture of summary and detail objects for a single financial reporting group is not recommended. Refer to the chart of accounts for your entity type in the UN manual for additional information on summary and detail object codes. Well, again, what is this about? Well, remember I mentioned that, you know, these accounts are indented by object code. You can see how some of these are to the left, some are in the center, some are to the right. Well, the items that are to the left, these are summary object codes. These are called sub-summary, and these are detail object codes. So you can see with purchase services, if I select the 300 purchase services, well, what this is saying essentially, this kind of consolidates all of the different detailed purchase services object codes and says, well, I can make a payment using purchase services, or I can make a payment in this program type using these detail object codes instead. It's not really recommended to use a combination of a summary object code and a detail object code. So if we look at our chart of accounts, when it talks about the we talk about the financial reporting groups, we're talking about this, like such things as employee fringe benefits, retirement contributions, salaries. So within each of these, or actually, if we go back to the funds, we got various financial reporting groups, governmental funds, general, special revenue, etc. And then in our appropriation object codes, we've got, if you look at the bold, these bold fields, like the 100 here, salaries, that represents a summary object code. This is summary object code, and the other ones that are not bolded are detail object codes. And we really recommend that you use either the detailed for each. Now if you could use detailed object codes for salaries, and then for employee fringe benefits, you could choose to use maybe a summary object code for insurance benefits. And that would be, we don't advise one way or another to do that, but you could do that with, what we don't recommend is that within the same financial reporting group, you use a combination of detailed. For instance, maybe this 252 and 250. They use a combination of detailed and summary object codes. Well, it's kind of beyond the scope of this class. We do allow you to do it. Notice that I can, if I click on Save here, this is, I can either cancel this or I can save it anyways. It's not recommended. If we look back at our book, kind of the error message is is discussed. We list one reason that we don't recommend this is it may cause confusion for you and for auditors when reviewing financial reports, especially prior year reports, and when looking at your results of in your budgeting and let me read this sentence here so I can say this right. One reason is it may cause confusion when reviewing financial reports and result in budgeting or payment mistakes. So that's why we don't recommend doing this. An exception, and it labels exception, is occasionally when you're changing from going from one year to the next, temporary mode, and temporary mode, I won't get into that, but temporary mode will be discussed in more detail when you get your year-end procedures manual. We have a version update at the end of every year, which gives you which will provide a year-end procedures manual, and it will explain temporary mode and why you might want to make an exception for this on occasion. But overall, we do not recommend doing this. For more information on summary and detail object codes, you can look at the back of this book in Appendix B. I think it's Appendix B. I might have mislabeled that. Very back of the book. Looks like this may not have listed the last page here. But at the very back end of the book, Appendix B, I've got a 1.5-page description of detailed and summary object codes. So if you need to learn about that or need a refresher on that, you can read that outside of class, or pause and read that now. All right, so I'll just cancel that because it's not recommended, and I'll close the screen. Now it says, do I want to save changes? In this case, I'm going to say no, I don't want to save any changes. And so that ends our discussion on adding and working with appropriation account codes. The next session, we're going to get into budgeting, revenue budgets, and appropriation budgets.